I was sitting in my old car parked at the edge of the woods. It was a place where I usually came to escape the noise of the city, but today I was here for a different reason. My phone lit up. A message from my cop friend: something strange happened in the area. Several missing people. Be careful. I laughed scornfully. It seemed to me that nothing could frighten me, but the fear that lay ahead was incomparably greater than anything I could have imagined. I got out of the car, took a flashlight and went to the dense forest where people were rumored to be disappearing. The night was dark and only the light of my flashlight cut through the black darkness. I had gone about a mile when I heard a sound, quiet but eerie, like a slight rustling. It wasn't just the wind, I knew it. My heart was beating faster, but I kept going. And then I saw it, a shadow that flashed quickly between the trees. I stopped and tried to focus my flashlight on the spot where she had disappeared, but I could see nothing but thick darkness. I stood still, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. He looked around, but there was no one there. My hand was shaking as I held the flashlight. I moved forward again, trying to quell the excitement. But with every step, I could feel something or someone getting closer. And suddenly I heard a voice. A quiet whisper coming from the darkness. Don't turn around. I froze. This whisper pierced me to the bone. Don't turn around? If only I could. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and my fingers began to slide on the flashlight from the moisture. All muscles were tense like a spring. I wanted to turn back, to run away, but something in that voice made me stand still. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. Who is it? I shouted, but in response I heard only the rustling of leaves. My head turned involuntarily at the sound, but I saw nothing. The forest was quiet, as if all nature was holding its breath. Only the sound of my own heartbeat hummed in my ears. Don't turn around. You're not ready to see this, the voice whispered again, now a little closer, as if he were there. I stood still, as if in a stupor, trying to keep my sanity. And then I heard a sound similar to the movement of fingers on the bark of a tree, the crunch of branches under my feet. Someone was approaching, cautiously, slowly. My flashlight suddenly started flickering and my heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I decided to go on without turning around as the voice asked. Step by step, slowly but surely, I continued to move forward, to that part of the forest where the trees grew so thick that the flashlight could barely penetrate through their branches. And that's when I saw it, something like an old abandoned house, half planted in the ground, tangled with branches and ivy. There was a rusted sign on the door, worn away by time, but I could still make out the words, "No trespassing." But something inside me seemed to attract me to this place. I moved closer, feeling the flashlight begin to fade. I took the last step to the threshold, and suddenly I heard that voice again, this time right behind me. You made a mistake. I quickly turned around, almost dropping the flashlight, but there was no one behind me. The wind rustled in the treetops, and the darkness around seemed even thicker and colder. I tried to convince myself that it was just a game of imagination. But that voice was so real. The sense of danger was growing like a thunderstorm creeping in from afar. I turned to the door of the house and could no longer ignore the strange smell coming from inside. The smell of dampness, rotting, and something else I couldn't identify. I pulled myself together and opened the door. They squealed so loudly that I was startled. Inside it was dark and damp, like a grave. The flashlight illuminated a small room with slanted walls with water running down them. I took a step forward and heard something crunch underfoot. He took a flashlight, bent down and saw scattered fragments of glass. Someone has clearly been here before, maybe even recently. I walked a few more steps and suddenly heard a sound from deep inside the house. It was a soft cry, like a child's, weak and pitiful. My heart shuddered and I felt a cold sweat run down my back. Who's there? I asked, trying not to betray my fear. The response was immediate. The echo of my voice seemed alive, bouncing off the walls. And again, this quiet crying that came from the basement, where the old wooden steps led. The flashlight flickered, illuminating each uneven step. The crying got louder and I couldn't tell if it was the baby or something else, something much worse. I stopped at the entrance to the basement, staring into the black abyss before me. The voice whispered again, this time right next to my ear, "You can still come back, but hurry." I squeezed the flashlight so hard that my fingers turned white. Reason said one thing, but my curiosity pulled me down. I started down the stairs, one step at a time, every creak of the wood echoing ominously in my head. The crying grew louder, more desperate, and already seemed very close. I reached the bottom of the stairs and, raising my flashlight, I saw an old, dusty corridor ahead of me. Something moved in the distance and I shined a beam of light towards it, trying to see what it was. And then I understood. It was not a child's cry. It was someone else who was suffering, or someone who was trying to trap me. I stood in the dark corridor trying to collect my thoughts. The crying I heard earlier suddenly changed to a faint laughter that came from somewhere deep in the basement. It was laughter, not human, not natural, like the screeching of something rusty, like the sound of an old swing swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath and moved on. Every step I took sounded like an explosion, bouncing off the walls and pressing on my consciousness. With each step, the light of the flashlight grew dimmer, as if the darkness itself was consuming it. Finally, I saw a door at the end of the corridor. They were slightly ajar, and the light of a candle was coming from behind them. I came closer, my heart was beating wildly. When I opened the door, I saw a small room lined with old furniture covered with a thick layer of dust. There was a table in the center, and a single candle was burning on it. The flames trembled, creating strange shadows on the walls. My eyes adjusted to the semi-darkness, and I saw that there were some drawings on the walls. He came closer, and the hair on the back of his head stood on end. These were children's drawings drawn with charcoal or perhaps even with blood. Each drawing depicted the same figure, a tall, thin silhouette with crooked limbs, arms reaching out toward the viewer. I stepped back, tripping over something hard. He looked down and saw something like a doll, old, worn, covered with stains and dirt. The doll was lying on the floor, its head turned in my direction, but its eyes, they were looking straight at me. Unbelievably, they seemed to be moving. I stepped back quickly and the doll rolled onto its side with a thud. Suddenly the door closed behind me with a terrible thud, and I heard something lock it from the outside. I rushed to the door trying to open it, but to no avail. The crying filled the room again, but now it echoed from all sides, getting louder and louder. I realized that I had fallen into a trap. With trembling hands, I turned and saw the walls begin to slowly shrink. I felt the air become thick, heavy, and it was as if it were getting harder to breathe. A voice in my head whispered, "Now you will understand what real fear is." I began to scan the room for an exit, feeling panic creeping closer and closer. My consciousness began to cloud as I saw another door half hidden behind old curtains. I rushed towards them, trying not to think about what might be waiting for me behind them. When I opened them, I felt a cold wind blowing from the other side. Forward is only one way, other options have disappeared. I stepped over the threshold, knowing that there was only darkness ahead, but realizing that it was too late to turn back. Darkness covered me like a blanket, and it immediately became difficult to breathe. The wind I felt earlier disappeared as quickly as it appeared, leaving me in a soundless void. I tried to inhale, but the air became thick and viscous, like fog on a cold autumn morning. The light of the flashlight was almost extinguished, and I groped my way forward. My hands hit the walls, cold, wet, dripping with water. As I made my way further, I felt strange growths under my fingers that looked like fungi or mold that had been growing here for years. Something about this place was terribly wrong. As I walked further, I noticed that the corridor was getting thicker, the walls seemed to be squeezing, pressing on me from both sides. I could hardly move now when I smelled a new smell, pungent and metallic like the smell of blood. The sensation was so sudden and strong that I instinctively stopped. My heart pounded in my chest and every breath I took seemed too loud in this ominous silence. I took another step and suddenly I felt something soft, slippery under my foot. I bent down, pointing the flashlight down, and saw red stains on the floor. Blood. My mind tried to find an explanation, but nothing reasonable came to mind. I slowly raised the flashlight up and saw them. On the walls, glistening in the dim light, were written the words, scrawled with something sharp, "Stay still." And then I heard it. A quiet, almost imperceptible sound breathing. But it didn't belong to me. I listened, trying to catch where it was coming from. My heart beat faster. I knew I wasn't alone. Breathing was uneven, heavy, like a person struggling for every breath of air. It was getting closer. Before I could come to my senses, I heard quick footsteps coming from the depths of the corridor. They were fast and heavy, like someone running, unable to stop. I turned, pointing my flashlight into the darkness, and saw movement. Something was coming straight at me, fast and silent. I realized that I had only one chance. I rushed forward, trying to find a way out until the walls closed in completely. The footsteps behind me were getting closer, but I didn't look back. A familiar laugh was heard in the corridor, now louder, unbearable, like the clatter of iron against stones. I could feel the adrenaline hitting my head, forcing me to run faster. There was a faint glimmer of light ahead, and I ran there as fast as I could. I felt someone almost touching my back, as if reaching with their hands. And then I saw the door, old, worn, but it seemed to be my only salvation. I rushed to the door, slammed my whole body into it, and it opened with a terrible creak. I collapsed inside and quickly closed them behind me, pressing my back against the tree trying to catch my breath. My heart was beating so hard that it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. There was a soft knock on the other side of the door, followed by silence. I stood there absorbing every sound, but everything remained still. I was safe at this point, but deep down I knew this was just the beginning. I stood in the dark with my back pressed against the old door, listening to my heavy breathing and the pounding of my heart in my chest. It seemed to me that every sound, every echo of my movement could betray me to whoever or whatever was pursuing me. But it was quiet outside the door. The knocking stopped and only an oppressive silence filled the space. I looked around. The room I found myself in was dark and forlorn. The flashlight, which was almost no longer shining, allowed us to see only the outlines of large objects. The room seemed empty, except for a few old, broken pieces of furniture that were haphazardly strewn about. The smell of dampness and mold penetrated my nostrils, making me wince. A crumpled sheet of paper lay on the floor at my feet. I picked it up, feeling the paper wet and brittle, almost crumbling in my fingers. Unfolding the sheet, I saw a strange drawing, a schematic plan of a building with several rooms marked in arrows leading to the center. In the very center of the picture was written something difficult to read. I squinted to see better, and realized that there was one word written there: escape. My stomach clenched with a sudden sense of anxiety. I didn't know who left this plan, but my intuition told me it was for me. I decided to follow the shooters. It seemed like the only option. In any case, staying here in the dark was no less dangerous. I took the first step, carefully holding the flashlight in front of me. My every movement echoed, and the silence around me seemed even more eerie. The room was long, but the arrows on the paper pointed to a door at the far end. I walked over to them and pressed the handle, hoping they weren't locked. The door opened easily, and I stepped into another corridor, even darker and narrower than the previous one. The light from the flashlight grew weaker with each passing second, but I continued walking, following the arrows on the piece of paper. They led me left, right, then forward again. The corridors wound like a labyrinth, and it seemed that they had no end. And suddenly I heard it again, light footsteps behind me. My heart began to beat faster, and I turned, shining a dim flashlight beam into the darkness. But I saw nothing but an empty corridor. I didn't know if it was my imagination playing tricks on me or if someone was really there. The steps became louder, faster. They were approaching. I began to run, feeling fear paralyze my thoughts. The flashlight was almost completely extinguished and I could barely see the arrows on the plan. The corridor began to narrow and I could feel the walls closing in around me. I reached the door where the arrows were breaking off. He opened them with all the strength he could muster and collapsed into the new room. This room was completely different. It was small with bare concrete walls. A large chalk circle was drawn on the floor, and an old wooden chair stood in the center. And then I heard a voice, the same one who whispered to me earlier. But this time it was loud and clear: "Sit down if you want to survive." I knew I couldn't trust that voice, but something compelled me to obey. I stared at the chair, feeling its ominous silhouette beckon me like a magnet. Was it a trap? Or maybe the only way to save yourself? I stepped closer, feeling the fear grip me from the inside, and made my choice. I took a deep breath and decided to sit on the chair. I was haunted by the feeling that this choice was a trap, but the voice in my head was so convincing that I could not resist. When I sat down, the room fell into absolute silence. The flashlight finally went out, leaving me in complete darkness. For a moment nothing happened, only my own breath echoed in the narrow space. And then I heard something move in the room. At first it was a barely audible rustle, and then a sound like the hissing of a snake. The mind was panicking in the head, but the body froze as if chained to a chair. Suddenly something cold and slippery covered me. Straps, similar to the body of a snake, began to wrap around my wrists and ankles, pulling me tightly to the chair. I struggled desperately to free myself, but the straps tightened, taking away any possibility of movement. I felt like I was being pulled into an abyss. The voice that had whispered to me before suddenly came again, but this time it was not behind me, but just inside my head, deep and sharp. "Now you will see the truth." And then a light exploded in front of me, bright and blinding, forcing me to close my eyes. I felt the room around me start to spin like a vortex. Sounds, whispers, laughter, crying, everything mixed into a deafening chaos. I felt myself being sucked into some terrible abyss, and my brain screamed in panic. And then everything quieted down. I slowly opened my eyes and realized that I was sitting in the same room. But something has changed. The room was clean, without dust and mold, without drawings on the walls and strange smells. The light was soft, pleasant. The straps that held me were gone. I stood up, feeling my legs shaking. Looking around, I saw that the door of the room was open. I approached them, hoping that this might be a way out. I peeked out the door and saw stairs leading up to a dim light. Hope filled my soul and I rushed forward, climbing the stairs as fast as I could. When I reached the top of the stairs, I found myself in a small room that looked like a police office. A pile of old newspapers lay on the table in front of me. I picked up one of them and saw the headline, "New Witness Found in Disappearance Case." I was in the photo in the newspaper. And under the title, a small subtitle, "Survivor After 20 Years of Imprisonment in an Abandoned House." I stood still, trying to understand what it all meant. How could I disappear for 20 years? How could I survive in this place? I looked around for an answer and suddenly saw my face reflected in the mirror on the opposite wall. It was older, exhausted, tired. But it was me. At that moment the door opened and a policeman entered. He looked at me with surprise and sympathy, asked, "You finally got out of there? We've been waiting for you all this time." I couldn't speak. The words stuck in my throat. I just nodded, feeling tears well up in my eyes. The policeman came closer, took my hand and said, "You are safe now. This was no place for people. And to this day no one knows what it was." I realized that I survived, but the mystery of this house will stay with me forever. I was let go, but every time I close my eyes, I hear that small whisper that always reminds me that I'd better never go back there.